The Ardennes, December 16, 1944. Snow fell in silence that morning, heavy, slow, and deceiving. The frozen hills of the Ardennes seemed lifeless beneath a sky the color of steel. American sentries from the 99th Infantry Division stood half asleep in their foxholes, breath misting in the dawn, rifles wrapped in frost. For weeks nothing had moved but the wind. Then at 05:30 the forest erupted. The horizon flashed orange as thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire in unison. The ground shook, trees splintered, and the stillness that had lulled the front into calm vanished in thunder. Through the rolling fog, dark columns appeared. Panther and Tiger tanks pushing through the pines, engines growling beneath branches heavy with snow. Loudspeakers blared German marching songs. Within hours, entire American regiments were cut off. Radio lines snapped, villages vanished under shell fire. For the first time since Normandy, the Western Front was collapsing, and Hitler's generals rejoiced. They had sworn the Ardennes was impenetrable, that no army could advance through its forests in winter. But within those same trees, U.S. soldiers were already digging in, ready to drive through snow, ice, and fire to prove them wrong. In the winter of 1944, Hitler stood before his generals in the Reich Chancellery map room and pointed to a stretch of green and white on the Western Front. "There," he said, jabbing the Ardennes forest with his finger, "we will strike there where they least expect it." The plan was called Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last great gamble of the war. Its goal was nothing less than to split the Allied armies, drive to the port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers into a negotiated peace before the Red Army reached Berlin. It was a bold, desperate scheme, conceived not from strength, but from denial. The German army of late 1944 was a shadow of its former self. The Eastern Front consumed men and steel daily, the Luftwaffe barely existed, and fuel reserves were nearly gone. Yet Hitler believed that a single massive strike could change everything. He called it a blow of fate. His generals, Rundstedt, Model, Monteuffel, and Dietrich, obeyed, though many doubted success. The Ardennes seemed to offer the perfect deception. The Allies viewed it as secondary terrain, steep ridges, narrow roads, and dense pine forests that armored divisions could barely navigate. It was sparsely defended by inexperienced American units recovering from earlier battles, divisions like the 99th and 106th, newly arrived and ill-equipped for winter warfare. Hitler saw opportunity in their complacency. The plan's foundation rested on surprise. The offensive would begin under the cover of blinding weather, fog, snow, and freezing rain that would ground Allied aircraft. Three armies, the 6th SS Panzer, the 5th Panzer, and the 7th Army, would strike west through Belgium, crossing the Meuse River and capturing Antwerp within days. The Germans hoped that chaos and exhaustion would paralyze the Allies before they could react. But even in planning, reality strained the illusion. There was barely enough fuel to reach the Meuse, much less Antwerp. Tanks were disguised to look like American Shermans to sow confusion. English-speaking commandos were trained to infiltrate Allied lines in captured uniforms, changing road signs and spreading false orders. It was an operation built on deception, bravado, and the last reserves of an empire at its end. Hitler's generals raised concerns. Rundstedt called the plan unrealistic. Model called it madness. But none could sway the Führer. He believed divine intervention would favor Germany one last time. "The enemy thinks us finished," he told his staff. "That is why we will win." Meanwhile, Allied intelligence dismissed the growing signs. Intercepted radio chatter, unusual troop movements, and prisoner reports were all downplayed. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a rest area for divisions rotating off the line. Eisenhower's headquarters focused on supply and preparations for the push into Germany. not defense against it. When the offensive began on December 16, 1944, it struck with shocking precision. Over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,800 tanks and assault guns, poured through the fog. They smashed into American positions along a 70-mile front, cutting roads, isolating towns, and engulfing entire regiments. The attack achieved total surprise. For 2 days, the German advance seemed unstoppable. Columns of panzers thundered west, leaving burning vehicles and shattered trees in their wake. Villages like Losheim, St. Vith, and Clairvaux fell in hours. Thousands of American troops were captured. Others retreated through snow and confusion, believing the front had collapsed entirely. From his command post in Berlin, Hitler believed destiny had returned. "The Western Front will crumble," he told Goebbels. "We will strike a political miracle." But miracles are rare in winter. Even as German armor rolled forward, fuel trucks ran dry. Communications faltered, bridges clogged, and icy roads slowed the advance. And from within that blizzard of chaos, American soldiers began to stand, fight, and hold. The Ardennes, once thought to be Germany's shield, was about to become its grave. In the weeks before the offensive, the Ardennes front seemed like the quietest place in Europe. Snow fell daily over the fir trees, burying trenches, muting gunfire, and turning the front line into a landscape of silence. To the Allied command, the sector was a place to rest battered divisions, a winter lull before the final push into Germany. The American units stationed there were young, understrength, and cold. The 99th Infantry Division held a thin line near the Belgian border. The 106th Infantry, newly arrived and barely acclimated, guarded the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. They shared the front with scattered elements of the 28th Division, whose men were still recovering from the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. Few had winter clothing fit for the deep freeze that gripped the region. In the tiny villages of Krinkelt, Rotterath, and St. Vith, soldiers built fires from broken fences, melted snow for water, and wrote letters home describing boredom rather than fear. The enemy, they were told, was beaten back beyond the Siegfried Line. Intelligence briefings mentioned no signs of major activity. Many believed the war was nearing its end. But the forest told another story. In the nights before the attack, locals reported the distant rumble of engines echoing through the trees. German scouts slipped through the snow, mapping roads, marking targets. Entire armored divisions assembled in valleys hidden by fog and pine. Mantefel's 5th Panzer, Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer, Brandenburger's 7th Army. The buildup was enormous, yet invisible, cloaked by winter and silence. The Ardennes itself was deceptive terrain, thick woods broken by narrow roads and steep ravines. Snowdrifts turned paths into traps. Fog made visibility nearly zero. The Americans believed no large army could maneuver there. But Hitler's staff saw the forest's difficulty as its greatest advantage. If they could move tanks through it unseen, they could reach the Meuse before the Allies understood what was happening. The weather became their ally. Low clouds grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft, while freezing rain muffled sound. The U.S. Air Force, normally the Allies' all-seeing guardian, was blind. Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles received fragmentary reports, radio silence, delayed messages, garbled warnings from frontline units, but the pattern remained hidden. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the first German artillery shells ripped through that illusion. Batteries of 105mm and 150mm guns opened fire across the 70-mile sector. Within minutes, American communications collapsed. Observation posts vanished. When the shelling lifted, hundreds of German tanks surged forward, their iron tracks grinding over snow and frozen soil. The fog that had hidden them now hid their approach. American outposts were overrun within hours. Commanders tried to rally. But the scale of the attack was incomprehensible. By noon, roads were clogged with refugees and retreating convoys. The thin Allied line fractured into pockets of resistance, isolated towns fighting without orders, surrounded by the roar of engines in the mist. Hitler's generals had done the unthinkable. They had breached the Ardennes. But their victory was not yet secure. Every mile they gained deepened their supply problem. Every tank that burned irreplaceable fuel carried them closer to exhaustion. And among the scattered American units still holding the line, a stubborn resistance began to emerge. In snow-covered villages, soldiers dug in, refusing to yield. They fought not for strategy or orders, but for survival. The German plan had depended on panic, but panic never fully came. The Ardennes, so quiet for months, had exploded into the fiercest battle the Western Front would ever see. And in that white inferno, both armies would soon learn that the forest's real barrier was not its trees. It was the men within them. The Ardennes had always been a paradox, too dense for tanks, too open for defense, too quiet for attention. It stretched across Belgium and Luxembourg like a living wall of pine and ice. Narrow valleys, winding roads, and steep ridges turned every mile into a tactical puzzle. For the Germans, it offered concealment. For the Americans, confinement. The forest could swallow whole divisions without a sound. The generals on both sides had underestimated its power. The Allies saw it as a rear area, a place of rest. The Germans viewed it as a highway only if God froze the ground solid. When the temperature dropped in December 1944, Hitler called it Providence. His armored spearheads rolled through terrain the Allies considered impassable. But nature gave and took in equal measure. The same ice that hardened the soil clogged engines. The same fog that hid tanks blinded commanders. The Ardennes did not favor either side. It punished both. Each hill became a fortress, each tree a shield. Battles unfolded in fragments. A tank caught between trunks, a squad ambushed from the mist, a road seized and lost within hours. Strategy dissolved into survival. The forest, indifferent and cold, became the war's true commander. The winter of 1944 was among the coldest Europe had seen in decades. Snow buried the roads, froze rivers, and sealed aircraft to runways. American troops in thin coats shivered through nights that reached 20 degrees C. Rifles jammed, fuel thickened, and men woke with frostbite that turned fingers black. For the Germans, the weather was both blessing and curse. The heavy fog grounded Allied aircraft, giving their columns freedom to move. But their own supply trucks stalled on icy inclines, engines seized, and fuel froze in drums. The offensive that depended on speed slowed to a crawl. Tanks abandoned by the roadside became monuments to the weather's betrayal. Soldiers fought as much against the elements as against each other. Shells buried themselves harmlessly in snowbanks. Corpses froze where they fell. The battlefield was silent between barrages. The only sounds the crunch of boots and the distant thrum of engines echoing through the woods. It was a battle fought not for ground, but for endurance. Amid the chaos, the American soldier, anonymous, exhausted, and outnumbered, became the hinge of history. At crossroads and hamlets, cooks, clerks, and engineers picked up rifles and formed improvised lines. They had no illusions of glory. Their orders were simple: hold. In the villages of Lanzerath, Hansfeld, and Rockerath, tiny platoons resisted entire German regiments. One reconnaissance squad of the 394th Infantry held off more than 500 paratroopers for nearly a day, delaying an entire division's advance. Elsewhere, artillery crews fired point-blank at tanks until overrun. What distinguished these soldiers was not training, but refusal. They refused to retreat when orders failed, refused to surrender when surrounded, refused to believe that the Ardennes could belong to anyone but them. Some fought to the last bullet, others to the last breath. The civilians, caught in the middle, suffered the same test of will. Belgian families hid soldiers in cellars, shared bread with strangers, and marked danger by the sound of engines passing in the dark. The forest that once protected their villages now devoured them. For the Germans, the offensive that began with confidence became a nightmare of attrition. They expected panic. They found defiance. American positions that should have collapsed held stubbornly. Every delay drained fuel, ammunition, and time. The Ardennes, meant to be Germany's breakthrough, became its labyrinth. By Christmas, the forest's deception was complete. It had swallowed an army of panzers and left behind only wreckage and frozen men. Yet out of that destruction, something larger began to take shape, a defiance that would soon find its voice at a place called Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge was a contest not only of armies, but of wills. In Berlin, Hitler commanded from maps and delusion, convinced that this winter offensive would fracture the Allied coalition. He ignored the warnings of his generals. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt advised retreat when the offensive began to stall. Field Marshal Walter Model urged caution, fearing encirclement. Hitler silenced them both. Victory, he insisted, comes to the one who believes hardest. His conviction replaced fuel, logic, and reality. On the Allied side, leadership looked different. General Dwight Eisenhower, calm and deliberate, refused to panic. He saw the German advance for what it was, a desperate thrust, not a new beginning. His order was simple: hold the shoulders, plug the gaps, and counterattack. While headquarters reorganized, men at the front turned that clarity into courage. No commander embodied that clarity more fiercely than George S. Patton. In France, when news of the German attack reached him, Patton was already thinking ahead. He told his staff, "We'll pivot the Third Army 90 degrees and hit them in the flank." Within 48 hours, his divisions were on the move, an operational miracle that defied terrain, distance, and weather. Patton's energy transformed retreat into reversal. The Germans began the offensive with some of the finest tanks in the world, the Panther, the Tiger II, the Jagdpanther. Their armor was formidable, their guns unmatched. But power meant little without fuel. Every mile consumed precious reserves. Every burned vehicle was irreplaceable. As the advance deepened, fuel shortages crippled the offensive. Crews abandoned tanks on the roadside, their engines silent in the frost. The Americans fought with fewer heavy tanks, but greater coordination. The M4 Sherman, outgunned on paper, won through mobility and numbers. Allied artillery, directed by forward observers and coordinated through radio networks, blanketed choke points with devastating precision. Even without air support, the Americans wielded organization as their most powerful weapon. When the weather finally cleared on December 23rd, the skies filled with Allied aircraft, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Marauders sweeping the roads. Columns of retreating German armor were shredded in minutes. Hitler's gamble, already faltering, now burned openly in the snow. Technology had shifted the balance. The forest that had shielded the German approach became a death trap once the Allies regained the air. The same fog that once grounded their planes now lifted, revealing roads choked with wreckage. The Luftwaffe, shattered and fuel-starved, could offer no protection. The cost of defiance was staggering. Entire villages disappeared beneath artillery fire. Roads became lined with wrecks and frozen bodies. At Malmedy, American prisoners were executed by SS troops, an atrocity that steeled Allied resolve rather than broke it. The word spread like wildfire. No quarter. In Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, the 101st Airborne Division fought with dwindling supplies, no air support, and little hope of rescue. They endured sub-zero nights in shallow foxholes, their bandages frozen stiff, their rations gone. Yet, when the German commander demanded surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe gave a single-word reply: nuts. The message, relayed across the lines, became a symbol of defiance heard around the world. Courage in the Ardennes came in quiet forms. Medics worked barehanded in snow, saving men whose blood froze before it hit the ground. Clerks became riflemen, mechanics manned artillery, chaplains carried stretchers. The American line bent but never broke. For the Germans, every hour of resistance meant delay, and delay was fatal. Their timetable collapsed. Fuel dumps were captured, supply routes cut, and the once disciplined advance dissolved into confusion. What began as Hitler's masterpiece of surprise became an open wound across his collapsing empire. By Christmas Eve, the offensive had lost its rhythm. The frozen forest that had promised victory now trapped thousands of soldiers in its silence. The Americans, battered but unbroken, began to push back. Patton's columns were closing in from the south, their engines roaring through the same snow that had hidden their enemy. The turning point had arrived, a moment carved in frost and fire. By December 20th, 1944, the town of Bastogne was surrounded. 7 major roads converged there, making it the vital crossroads of the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne held the heart of the battlefield. For the Germans, it was the key to their drive west. For the Americans, it became a symbol of defiance carved into snow and smoke. Inside the encirclement were about 11,000 men of the 101st Airborne Division, joined by elements of the 10th Armored and remnants of shattered units that had fallen back from the front. They had little food, almost no medical supplies, and only a fraction of their winter gear. The thermometer dropped below freezing every night. Ammunition was rationed. Still, they held. The first German assaults began on December 19th. Tanks rolled through the mist, their engines muffled by snow. Paratroopers from the 101st dug into foxholes at Foy, Noville, and Marvy, met them with rifles and bazookas that jammed from the cold. Entire platoons were wiped out, yet the line barely moved. Major General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander, summed up their orders in one word: hold. By December 22nd, German emissaries under a white flag approached Bastogne's perimeter. They carried a typed ultimatum demanding the Americans surrender to avoid annihilation. McAuliffe's response was brief and unforgettable: nuts. His staff typed it neatly and handed it back. The message, relayed by radio and word of mouth, raced through Allied lines. To soldiers freezing in trenches miles away, it became a rallying cry, proof that the line still lived. That night, Bastogne endured its worst bombardment. Shells crashed through the forest, setting trees ablaze despite the snow. Civilians huddled in cellars while medics worked by candlelight. Every building in the town bore scars: shattered roofs, blown-out windows, frozen blood on stone floors. Yet morale held. Soldiers joked about McAuliffe's reply as if laughter itself could warm them. Outside the ring, Patton's Third Army was already on the move. Against all expectation, his divisions had pivoted north from Lorraine, advancing more than 100 miles in 3 days through ice, sleet, and wrecked roads. Convoys of Shermans, trucks, and tank destroyers crawled forward while engineers cleared paths through the blizzard. Men slept standing up, faces wrapped in scarves of frozen breath. The weather that had once sheltered the Germans now punished them. Inside Bastogne, hope flickered but did not fade. Airdrops from C-47s, guided by brief breaks in the clouds, brought crates of ammunition and bandages. Paratroopers retrieved them under fire, dragging parachutes through open fields where snipers watched. One crate of medical morphine meant life for dozens. The defenders endured constant shelling, rationing food to a handful of crackers and coffee per day. The forest around the town became a frozen graveyard. Trees shredded by artillery looked like broken spears. The smell of cordite mixed with pine sap. Snow covered bodies where they fell, concealing the cost of the stand. Yet the men of the 101st refused to give ground. When reporters later asked how they survived, one sergeant answered simply, "Because we couldn't leave." On December 23rd, the sky finally cleared. The droning hum of engines announced what everyone had prayed for: Allied aircraft. P-47. Thunderbolts swept in low, strafing German columns caught in the open. Supply planes followed, dropping food, ammunition, and medical kits. For the first time in a week, Bastogne breathed. Still, the siege was not over. The Germans launched one last furious assault on December 25th, hoping to crush the pocket before Patton arrived. They failed. American anti-tank guns, firing point-blank through the snow, shattered the attack. At dawn on December 26th, the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines south of Bastogne. The encirclement was broken. When Patton entered the town later that day, he found soldiers filthy, frostbitten, and grinning. They had held for 10 days against one of the fiercest assaults of the war. Bastogne had not fallen. In that frozen crucible, the myth of German invincibility shattered. Hitler's impenetrable forest had become the stage for one of the most defiant stands in American military history. The road to the Rhine now lay open, and Patton was ready to take it. The storm broke not in the sky, but on the ground, in the grinding thunder of engines. On December 23, 1944, while Bastogne still burned, General George S. Patton's Third Army was already pushing north through the worst winter Europe had seen in a century. The movement was unprecedented. An entire army group pivoted 90 degrees on ice-clogged roads and moved more than 100 miles to strike the German flank. It was a feat that stunned friend and foe alike, speed born of fury. Patton's columns moved in 3 great thrusts. The 4th Armored Division led the way, followed by the 26th Infantry and 80th Infantry Divisions. Snow blinded drivers. Tanks skidded on frozen bends. Engineers worked by lantern light, laying steel planks over icy slopes. The air stank of exhaust and cold iron. Soldiers marched beside their vehicles, rifles slung, breath turning white in the headlights. One officer later wrote, "We did not fight the Germans first. We fought the weather. Every mile north brought resistance. German units of the 5th Panzer Army dug into ridges and villages, turning each hamlet into a fortress. Fighting was close, brutal, and constant. The sky flashed with tracers, artillery thundered across valleys. In some towns, American tanks and German Panthers traded fire across streets, no wider than alleys. Snow turned black with soot and blood. Yet Patton's men kept moving. They were exhausted, freezing, and half-starved. But they moved. Patton himself drove the advance with his trademark ferocity. Touring his front lines in an open jeep, he barked orders through the blizzard. "We're going to Bastogne," he told his officers. "And we're going to break that siege, even if we have to crawl there." His headquarters, mobile and relentless, coordinated attacks hour by hour. Radios crackled with clipped reports. "Objective taken. Road clear. Moving north again." For the Germans, the counterattack was a nightmare. Their supply lines had stretched too far. Fuel dumps were empty, and every mile of retreat invited disaster. Tanks that had once roared confidently through the forest now sputtered out and were abandoned. Panzer divisions that had started the offensive with hundreds of vehicles now fought with dozens. The forest, once their ally, trapped them. By December 24th, Patton's vanguard was within 10 miles of Bastogne. Snow still fell, muting the sound of battle into a dull roar. German artillery fired blindly into the storm, trying to slow the advance. But momentum had shifted irreversibly. Each destroyed tank was replaced. Each frozen soldier was carried forward by the will of the man beside him. The offensive that Hitler had declared the turning point of the war was now collapsing under its own weight. On December 26th, the lead tank of the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, broke through to the southern edge of Bastogne. American soldiers inside the town cheered as the tank rolled up the road, its crew coated in snow and grime. The siege was over. McAuliffe's 101st had held, and Patton had delivered. The counterattack didn't stop there. Patton's divisions kept pressing north and east, driving the Germans back across the Ardennes. By New Year's Day, the once mighty panzer columns were retreating through the same forests they had entered triumphantly 2 weeks earlier. The snow was littered with wrecks, burned-out Tigers, overturned trucks, shattered guns. German dead lay frozen where they fell, their great winter gamble reduced to silence. Patton's men paid heavily for every mile. Nearly 8,000 casualties fell in the drive to Bastogne alone. But their victory broke the back of the German offensive. By January 1945, the bulge on Allied maps, the wedge driven deep into Belgium, was gone. The line was restored, the momentum reclaimed. As Patton's tanks rolled through the cleared roads, one soldier carved into the frost on his Sherman's glacis plate, "Impenetrable, my ass." The battle that had begun in surprise and snow ended in fire and resolve. Hitler's last gamble had failed. His armies would never again mount a major offensive in the West. From Bastogne to the Rhine, the path lay open, and the Allies would march straight through it. The Ardennes, once a promise of German invincibility, had become the monument of their final defeat. By the first week of January 1945, the grand illusion of Wacht am Rhein was over. What Hitler had envisioned as a lightning strike to reclaim the Western Front had degenerated into chaos, a rout through snow and ruin. The German spearheads that had once carved deep into Belgium were now splintered, trapped, and retreating toward their own frontier. The bulge that had terrified Allied command just 3 weeks earlier was shrinking by the hour. The numbers told the story of collapse. Of the 200,000 German troops who began the offensive, nearly half were killed, wounded, or captured. Over 600 tanks and assault guns were lost, machines that Germany could no longer replace. The vaunted 6th SS Panzer Army, once elite, was reduced to fragments. Roads that had carried the offensive westward were now choked with burned-out vehicles and horse-drawn carts retreating under Allied air attacks. The Luftwaffe made one last attempt to shift the tide on January 1, 1945, with Operation Bodenplatte, a massive strike against Allied airfields. It achieved brief surprise but catastrophic cost. Hundreds of German aircraft were destroyed on takeoff or lost to anti-aircraft fire. The operation, meant to blind the Allies, instead finished the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. The skies over Europe belonged entirely to the Allies thereafter. On the ground, Patton's Third Army and Montgomery's forces from the north closed the pocket with surgical precision. Towns like Houffalize, La Roche, and St. Vith, once overrun, were liberated one by one. Resistance was fierce, but scattered. German units fought stubbornly, often to the last bullet, but without fuel or ammunition, they were ghosts, dangerous only for moments before vanishing into the forest. The winter that had sheltered their advance now froze their retreat. Abandoned tanks stood like blackened monuments against the snow. Soldiers marched eastward in rags, frostbitten and starving, many never reaching the Rhine. Hitler's dream of reaching Antwerp had ended only 50 miles from its starting line. The consequences for Germany were irreversible. The Battle of the Bulge consumed the last of its armored reserves, its fuel, and its faith. The divisions withdrawn from the Eastern Front to fight in the Ardennes left gaping holes that the Red Army would soon exploit. The Reich had gambled its final strength on a mirage, and lost it all. For the Americans, victory came at a brutal price: 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead, the costliest battle the U.S. Army would ever fight. Yet morale soared. The enemy who had once dictated initiative was now on the defensive everywhere. The Ardennes had tested not just military skill, but endurance itself. When Eisenhower toured the front in early January, he found wreckage and silence where once thunder had roared. "The Germans threw everything they had at us," he said quietly, "and we broke them." His staff officers called the victory Patton's miracle of movement and the soldiers' triumph of resolve. In Hitler's headquarters at the Adlerhorst, disbelief turned to fury. His generals dared not tell him the full scale of the defeat. He blamed the weather, his commanders, even divine betrayal. Anyone but himself. But the truth was clear. The Western Front was broken, and Germany's war was running out of time. The Ardennes had given Hitler his last gamble, and America its defining test. One empire collapsed in its arrogance. Another proved its strength in endurance. From the snowfields of Belgium to the banks of the Rhine, the momentum of history had shifted, irrevocably. The Battle of the Bulge ended not only in victory, but in revelation. When the guns fell silent in mid-January 1945, the Allies stood staring across the wreckage of Hitler's last gamble and saw the future of the war laid bare. Germany's offensive capacity was gone, its myth of invincibility drowned in the snow. From that moment forward, the question was no longer if the Allies would cross the Rhine, only when. Strategically, the Ardennes offensive was catastrophic for the Reich. To assemble the attack, Hitler had stripped the Eastern Front of armor and manpower, leaving it exposed to the Red Army's coming onslaught. Within weeks, Soviet forces would launch Operation Vistula Oder, driving to the outskirts of Berlin itself. In the West, the Wehrmacht's Panzer Reserves, the same divisions that had once rolled triumphantly through France, now lay in smoking ruin. The German army could never again mount a major counteroffensive. For the Allies, the Ardennes became both warning and affirmation. It exposed their vulnerability to surprise, but it also proved the resilience of their command system and the determination of their soldiers. Eisenhower's coordination of multinational armies, Patton's lightning maneuver, Montgomery's containment in the north, all demonstrated a flexibility that the German command could no longer match. The United States had matured into a fully modern military power capable of moving entire armies across continents in days. By February, the front stabilized along the Meuse and our rivers. Patton's Third Army and Hodges' First prepared for the crossing of the Rhine, while engineers repaired bridges and supply lines torn apart by the winter offensive. Liberty convoys once again poured through Antwerp, feeding a logistical torrent that stretched unbroken from New York to the Siegfried Line. In Germany, the morale collapse was total. Civilians in Cologne and Koblenz whispered of betrayal. Soldiers spoke of hopelessness. Hitler's speeches still thundered from radios, but his armies were shadows. What he had called the last miracle of the Third Reich had instead accelerated its end. The psychological shift was profound. The Allies, who had spent months grinding forward, now advanced with confidence. The Germans, who had gambled everything on one final strike, retreated, knowing nothing remained to gamble with. The Ardennes had turned from fortress to funnel, channeling the war's momentum straight into the heart of Germany. When American troops reached the Rhine in March, they found their path lined with wreckage from the winter battles. Burned panzers, broken guns, helmets half buried in thawing snow. The forest that Hitler had once described as the Wall of the West lay open and scarred. The victory in the Ardennes reshaped strategy for generations to come. It proved that industrial endurance, coordination, and logistics could triumph over aggression and surprise. It marked the end of maneuver warfare for Nazi Germany and the beginning of inevitable collapse. Within 4 months, Berlin would fall. Yet amid the triumph, the soldiers who had fought through the snow understood the price. They had seen comrades freeze, burn and vanish in blizzards of shellfire. They carried home not pride alone, but memory, the image of a forest that swallowed everything and gave back only silence. The Ardennes had begun as a test of terrain and ended as a testament to will. Through that frozen crucible, the path to victory and to peace was carved. In the quiet months after the war, when the snow melted and the pines of the Ardennes stood green again, the scars of December 1944 were still visible. Burnt trunks, shattered helmets, twisted iron frozen into the soil. Yet beneath the wreckage, the forest seemed to breathe again. The silence that had once signaled fear now spoke of survival. The Battle of the Bulge was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of belief and endurance. Hitler's generals had sworn that the Ardennes was nature's fortress, a barrier through which no enemy could pass. They trusted geography more than men. But the Americans who fought there, the infantryman in the foxhole, the tank driver in the snow, the medic crouched beside a frozen comrade, proved that the human will could make its own terrain. They did not win through brilliance or perfection, but through refusal to yield, to surrender, to die quietly in the cold. Each mile of forest they reclaimed was bought not with strategy, but with resilience. Against tanks and terror, they fought with stubbornness. Against the elements, they fought with faith. The Ardennes taught the world that the measure of power is not in what it conquers, but in what it endures. The forest that once swallowed armies became a monument to perseverance, a place where arrogance froze and courage held. Today, the villages of Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Houffalize stand rebuilt, their fields quiet, their forests at peace. Yet beneath the soil lie reminders of the winter when ordinary soldiers changed the course of history. The Ardennes was never impenetrable. It was merely waiting for men who would walk through snow and fire to prove that no barrier, natural or imagined, could stand against the will to be free.